The sun came up wrong that morning. Clara felt it the moment she opened her eyes in the half-collapsed cabin. Her father's cabin, though calling it hers now seemed like a sick joke. The light filtering through the busted window shutters had a yellow-gray quality, like old teeth, the kind of light that promised nothing good. She lay there on the thin mattress, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like continents she'd never see, and tried to remember what her father's voice sounded like. It had only been 3 months since they'd buried him, but grief had a way of stealing the small things first. She could remember his hands, huge, calloused, always smelling of leather and tobacco. She could remember the way he'd straightened his back after a long day, wincing but never complaining. But his voice? Gone. Like he'd never spoken at all. The paper had arrived 2 weeks ago. Legal language she barely understood, but the meaning was clear enough. Debts. Collections. Auction. The bank owned everything now. The 100 acres of scrubland her father had killed himself trying to work, the half-dozen cattle that were more bone than beef, the barn that leaned so far east it looked drunk, and her. That part had been explained by Mr. Yates, the banker, with the kind of gentle patience usually reserved for children and idiots. The debt was substantial. The land alone wouldn't cover it. So the court, in its wisdom, had decided Clara herself would be included in the auction as indentured labor. 7 years of service to whoever bought the property. It was legal. It was precedented. It was, Mr. Yates had assured her with his soft banker hands folded on his desk, actually quite generous given the circumstances. Could be worse, he'd said, smiling. Could be prison. Clara had nodded like she understood, like it made sense, like being sold was somehow a kindness. She sat up now, her nightgown sticking to her back with sweat despite the morning chill. The mirror across the room showed her what the town would see in a few hours. A big woman. Not tall, she barely cleared 5'5", but big. Wide hips, thick arms, a soft middle that no amount of hard work seemed to trim. Her face was round, unmemorable. Brown hair that frizzed in the humidity. Eyes that were neither green nor brown, but some muddy in between. Plain. That's what her father had called her, though he'd meant it kindly. You're plain, Clara, and that's just fine. Fancy things break easy. Except she'd broken anyway. She dressed slowly, her only good dress, dark blue cotton with buttons up the front. It was tight across the chest and hips, but it was clean. She'd washed it yesterday in the creek, scrubbed until her knuckles bled, because she'd be damned if she'd be sold looking dirty. The walk into town took 40 minutes. The ranch, she still thought of it that way, though it was more graveyard than working property, sat far enough from Blackwater that you couldn't hear the church bells on Sunday. Her father had liked it that way. Distance is honesty, he used to say. Keeps neighbors from pretending to be friends. He'd been right about that. The road was rutted dirt, flanked by scrub brush and the occasional skeletal tree. Clara's shoes, too small, pinching her toes, raised little puffs of dust with each step. She kept her eyes down, watching her feet, because looking up meant seeing the town getting closer, and that made her stomach lurch. She could already imagine it. The square would be packed. Half the county would show up for an auction like this, not because they wanted the land, but because they wanted the show. They'd stand in clusters, the men with their thumbs hooked in their belt loops, the women with their hands pressed to their mouths like they were scandalized but couldn't look away. They'd whisper. They'd point. They'd laugh. And she'd have to stand there and take it. The sun climbed higher. The day warmed. By the time the first buildings appeared on the horizon, the church spire, the grain elevator, the false fronts of Main Street, Clara's dress was soaked through with sweat and her feet were screaming. She stopped at the edge of town just past the Welcome to Blackwater sign with its peeling paint and tried to breathe. Her hands were shaking. Her vision kept narrowing at the edges, like she was looking through a tunnel. You can do this, she whispered. Her voice sounded small and unconvincing. You don't have a choice, so you can do this. But her feet wouldn't move. A wagon rattled past, the driver glancing at her with a mix of pity and amusement before snapping his reins and moving on. Clara watched him go, watched the dust settle, and felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This was it. The last morning of her life as Clara Whitmore, daughter of nobody, owner of nothing. By noon, she'd be property. A thing. A piece of inventory listed between cattle and lumber. She forced herself forward. Main Street was already crowded. People milled around the square like it was a festival, Kids chasing each other between the legs of adults, women clutching market baskets. Men gathered outside the saloon even though it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. The platform in the center of the square, usually used for speeches and concerts, had been cleared. A podium stood at the front. Behind it, someone had set up a chalkboard listing the items for auction. Clara saw her name on the board. Lot 7. Whitmore property. 100 acres, structures, livestock. Plus Clara Whitmore. 7 years service. Her knees nearly buckled. "There she is!" The voice cut through the crowd noise, sharp and delighted. Clara turned and saw Margaret Finch, the sheriff's wife, pointing directly at her. Margaret was small and pretty, with blonde curls and a waist Clara could probably wrap her hands around. She wore a pink dress that looked like it cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. "Oh my word, she actually came," Margaret said, not bothering to lower her voice. The women around her, a tight cluster of Blackwater's finest, all turned to stare. "I told you she would. She's got nowhere else to go." Laughter rippled through the group. Clara kept walking, eyes forward, jaw tight. "Just get to the platform. Just get through this." "Clara!" Another voice, male this time. She looked up and saw Thomas Beckett leaning against a post, grinning. He'd tried courting her once, back when her father was alive, brought her flowers and talked about his plans to expand his father's feed store. Then he'd gotten a good look at her in daylight and suddenly remembered he had business elsewhere. "You clean up nice. Almost didn't recognize you without the pig smell." More laughter, louder now. Someone else shouted something she didn't catch, but the tone was clear enough. The crowd was warming up, getting comfortable with the sport of it. Clara climbed the steps to the platform. Her legs felt like water. The auctioneer, a thin man named Samuels with a waxed mustache, glanced at her, then quickly away, like she was something embarrassing. "Stand over there," he muttered, pointing to a spot behind the podium. "Try not to, just stand still." She stood. From here, she could see everything. The entire town spread out before her like a judgment. Faces she'd known her whole life. People who'd bought eggs from her father, who'd tipped their hats to her at church, who told her they were sorry for her loss. All of them staring now, like she was a curiosity. A freak show. The auction started. First came farm equipment from the Anderson place, a plow, some tools, a wagon with a broken axle. Then 3 horses from the Donovan Ranch, then a dozen chickens. Each lot drew bids, sometimes spirited ones. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell in that sing-song rhythm, and money changed hands, and life went on like it was all perfectly normal. Then came Lot 7. "All right, folks," Samuels called out, his voice carrying across the square. "This next one's a package deal. We got the Whitmore property. That's 100 acres south of town. Decent grazing land if you're willing to put work into it. Comes with a house, a barn, 6 head of cattle, and—" He paused, glancing back at Clara. "And 7 years of labor from Miss Clara Whitmore here." He gestured for her to step forward. Clara's feet were nailed to the boards. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Come on now," Samuel said, his voice tight with irritation. "Let folks see what they're bidding on." Somehow she moved. 1 step, 2. Until she stood at the front of the platform, fully exposed, the sun beating down on her head and 100 pairs of eyes crawling over her like ants. "As you can see," Samuels continued, and there was something in his tone now, something that made Clara's skin prickle. "Miss Whitmore is a substantial woman. Strong, good for heavy work. She's healthy, no obvious defects, and she's biddable, quiet type. Won't give you trouble." He was describing her like livestock. Someone in the crowd snickered. "She ain't much to look at," a voice called out. Clara recognized it. James Porter, who ran the dry goods store. "What's she weigh, Samuels? Need to know if my wagon can handle her?" The crowd erupted. Laughter rolled across the square like thunder, people doubling over, slapping their knees, wheezing with delight. Clara stood frozen, her face burning, her eyes locked on a spot somewhere above the crowd's heads. Now, Samuel said, but he was grinning. "Let's keep it civil. Who'll start the bidding? We'll say $300 for the lot." Silence. Clara waited. The silence stretched. She could hear birds, a baby crying somewhere, the creak of wagon wheels. No one bid. 200? Samuels tried, his voice losing some of its confidence. "It's good land, folks. Just needs work." Nothing. Looks like it needs a lot more than work, someone muttered, loud enough to carry. More laughter. Clara's vision was blurring. She blinked hard, refusing to cry, refusing to give them that. $100, Samuel said, and now he sounded desperate. Come on, someone. The land alone is worth— I wouldn't take her if you paid me, a woman's voice cut through. Clara didn't look to see who. Didn't matter. They were all the same. The auctioneer cleared his throat, looked down at his papers. The silence was excruciating now, thick and ugly. Clara could feel the weight of it, crushing down on her shoulders, pressing her into the boards. This was worse than being sold. This was being rejected, being worth so little that even as free labor, no one wanted her. She should have stayed at the ranch. Should have let them drag her out. Should have— 300. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Deep, rough, male. Every head turned. Clara turned too, squinting against the sun. A man stood at the edge of the square, half in shadow. He was tall, taller than anyone else there, and built like he'd been carved from something harder than wood. His clothes were dark and travel-stained. His face was weathered, scarred, hard to read from a distance. He didn't smile, didn't move, just stood there like a piece of the landscape that had suddenly decided to speak. The crowd had gone dead silent. I'm sorry, Samuel said, leaning forward. Did you say— 300, the man repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. For the property and the woman. The way he said woman made Clara's skin crawl. Not cruel, not leering, just flat, like she was a chair, a tool, a thing in the inventory. Well, Samuel said, recovering quickly. Well, we have a bid. 300 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 350? No one spoke. The crowd seemed to shrink away from the stranger, creating a bubble of empty space around him. 300 going once, Samuels called. Going twice. Clara stared at the man. Even from here she could see the scars, a thick one across his left cheek, another disappearing into his collar. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone, just stared at the platform like he was calculating board feet. Sold! Samuels brought his gavel down with a crack that made Clara flinch. Lot 7 to the gentleman for $300. Sir, if you'll step up and settle the payment— The man moved. The crowd parted for him like water, people stepping back, mothers pulling their children close. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, but there was something inexorable about his movement, like a landslide, like gravity. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His face was all hard angles and old violence. The scar on his cheek was thick and ropey, the kind you got from something sharp and deliberate. His hands, when he reached into his coat for a money purse, were massive and covered in calluses and smaller scars. He counted out bills, old, worn money, and handed them to Samuels without a word. Pleasure doing business, Samuels said nervously. The deed will be ready for you to sign over at the land office. And the woman is— In the wagon. The man's voice was barely above a rumble. He still hadn't looked at Clara. Now. It wasn't a question. Clara's mouth went dry. She looked at Samuels, at the crowd, hoping for— what? Intervention? Mercy? But everyone was watching with the same expression. Relieved it wasn't them, curious to see what would happen, but not curious enough to get involved. She climbed down from the platform on shaking legs. The man was already walking away, heading toward a wagon parked on the far side of the square. Clara followed because she didn't know what else to do, because the law said she belonged to him now, because every other option had dried up and blown away. The wagon was old but solid, pulled by 2 massive draft horses that made Clara's cattle look like toys. The bed was empty except for a few burlap sacks and a coil of rope. The man, her owner— she had to start thinking of him that way— swung himself up onto the seat with surprising grace for his size. He didn't help her up, didn't even look back to see if she was coming. Clara grabbed the side of the wagon and hauled herself up, her dress catching on a splinter, her breath coming in short gasps. She sat on the far end of the bench, as far from him as possible, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles went white. The man snapped the reins, the horses moved, the wagon rolled forward. No one said goodbye. Clara watched Blackwater shrink behind them. The false front buildings getting smaller, the crowd dispersing like smoke. Margaret Finch was already walking away, laughing with her friends. Thomas Beckett had disappeared into the saloon. The platform stood empty, the chalkboard already being wiped clean. It was like she'd never existed. The man drove in silence. They left town, turned south onto the road Clara had walked that morning. Was it really just this morning? And kept going. The sun climbed higher. The air grew hot. Clara's dress stuck to her back again, and her feet throbbed in the two small shoes, and her throat was dry as dust. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't ask his name, didn't ask anything. What would be the point? After maybe 30 minutes, the wagon turned off the main road onto a smaller track. Two wheel ruts through dead grass, barely visible. Clara felt something lurch in her chest. This was the road to her father's ranch, to his ranch now. They crested a small rise, and there it was, the house she'd grown up in, the barn listing to one side, the empty corral, the land stretching out brown and barren to the horizon. It looked worse than she remembered, deader, like even the ghosts had given up. The man pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He sat there for a moment, surveying the property with those unreadable dark eyes. Clara couldn't tell if he was pleased or disappointed or just calculating. Finally, he spoke. "Name's Rowan Hale." Clara waited for more. Nothing came. "Clara," she said quietly. "Clara Whitmore." "I know." He swung down from the wagon, landing with a grunt. "Barn needs work. Corral's a loss. Half the fence is down. We'll start there tomorrow." The word didn't make her feel better. Rowan walked toward the barn without looking back. Clara sat in the wagon, watching him go, and felt the full weight of her new reality settle over her shoulders like a yoke. 7 years. She could do 7 years. People survived worse. She climbed down from the wagon, no help again, and stood in the dusty yard of what used to be her home, trying to figure out what came next. Rowan emerged from the barn a few minutes later, carrying a shovel and a hammer. He looked at her for the first time since buying her, his expression still giving nothing away. "You know how to work?" Clara bristled despite herself. "I'm not useless." "Didn't say you were. Asked if you know how to work." "Yes." "Good." He handed her the shovel. "Start clearing the drainage ditch on the east side. It's clogged. Rain comes and this whole place will flood." He walked away before she could respond. Clara stood there holding the shovel, feeling the afternoon sun beat down on her head, and tried to remember the last time she'd cried. It had been at her father's funeral, 3 months ago. She'd stood by the grave while the preacher droned on, and she'd cried because she was alone now, because the world was cruel, because nothing good lasted. She wasn't crying now. She walked to the east side of the property, found the drainage ditch, barely visible under years of debris and dead grass, and started digging. The work was hard. The shovel was heavy. Her hands weren't soft. She'd worked plenty before, but they weren't ready for this. Within an hour, she had blisters forming. Within 2, they'd popped and started bleeding. She kept digging. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows lengthened. Rowan appeared once, looked at her progress without comment, and disappeared again. Clara heard him working on the barn, the sound of hammering, the groan of wood being forced into place. She dug until her arms were numb and her back was screaming, and the ditch was clear enough to see the bottom. Then she stood there, swaying slightly, covered in dirt and sweat, and wondered if this was what the rest of her life looked like. Probably. When she made it back to the house, barely standing now, each step an individual negotiation with her body, she found Rowan on the porch. He'd set up a small camp stove and was cooking something that smelled like meat and beans. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. "Ditch clear?" he asked without looking up. "Yes." "Good. Wash up. Creek's that way." He pointed toward a line of scraggly trees. "Then eat." It wasn't an invitation. It was an instruction. Clara stumbled toward the creek, her vision spotting at the edges. The water was shallow and cold and tasted like minerals, but she dunked her whole head under and let it shock her back to alertness. When she cupped her hands and drank, it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. She washed her face, her arms, tried to get the worst of the dirt out of her dress. Her hands were a mess, raw and bleeding, the blisters angry and red. She stared at them and felt something that wasn't quite despair. When she got back to the porch, Rowan had set out 2 tin plates, one for him, one for her. Clara sat on the far end of the porch, as far from him as the space allowed, and ate. The food was simple: beans, some kind of cured meat, hard bread. But she was so hungry it didn't matter. She ate until her plate was clean, then sat there with her hands in her lap, waiting. Rowan finished his own food, set the plate aside, and finally looked at her. "You'll sleep in the house," he said. "There's a room in the back. I'll take the front. Door doesn't lock, but I won't bother you. I'm not that kind of man." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "Work starts at dawn. We'll fix the barn first, then the fences, then see about getting those cattle fattened up enough to sell. You do what I tell you, when I tell you, and we'll get along fine." Another nod. Rowan stood, collected the plates, and carried them inside. Clara heard water running, the sound of washing up. She sat alone on the porch as the sun set, painting the dead land in shades of orange and red. The sky was huge out here, endless, and for a moment she felt so small beneath it she might as well have never existed. Her father used to sit on this porch, used to watch the same sunset, used to tell her that land didn't forgive weakness, but it rewarded persistence. He'd been wrong about a lot of things. Clara went inside. The house was dark and smelled like dust and old memories. She found the back room, her old room, though all her things were long gone, and stood in the doorway staring at the empty space. This was her life now. She lay down on the bare floor, too exhausted to care about comfort, and closed her eyes. Sleep came fast, dragging her under like a hand around her throat. And somewhere in the darkness she heard Rowan moving through the house, his footsteps heavy and certain, and she wondered what kind of man bought a woman like she was livestock. She'd find out soon enough. Clara woke to the sound of someone moving through the house. For a disoriented moment she forgot where she was. Thought maybe her father was up early, starting coffee, getting ready for the day's work. Then her body reminded her. Every muscle screamed, her hands were stiff, the blisters from yesterday crusted over and throbbing. Her back felt like someone had taken a mallet to her spine. She opened her eyes to gray pre-dawn light filtering through a window she remembered cleaning as a child. The floor beneath her was hard as stone. She'd slept in her dress, and now it was wrinkled and filthy, stuck to her skin with dried sweat. The footsteps stopped outside her door. "You got 5 minutes," Rowan's voice came through the wood. "Then we work." Clara listened to him walk away, his limp more pronounced in the morning. She sat up slowly, biting back a groan, and tried to convince her body to cooperate. 5 minutes. She made it outside in 4, her hair barely finger-combed, her face splashed with creek water that had been cold enough to shock her awake. Rowan was already at the barn, surveying the damaged structure in the growing light. He glanced at her once, taking in her appearance with those unreadable eyes, then looked back at the barn. "You eat breakfast?" he asked. "No. Can't work on empty." He jerked his chin toward the house. "There's jerky in the saddlebag by the door. Eat while you walk." "Walk where?" "Timber's a mile north. We need posts for the corral. Can't fix anything without materials." Clara's stomach was eating itself, but she didn't move. "I cleared the ditch yesterday." "I know, I checked it last night." He started walking, expecting her to follow. "It's good work. Now we do today's work." She wanted to argue, wanted to say her hands were ruined, her body was breaking, that she needed rest. But the contract was clear, 7 years of labor. Not 7 years of labor when she felt up to it. 7 years of whatever he demanded. She found the jerky, tough as leather, but edible, and followed him north across the property, chewing as she walked. The land looked even worse in daylight. What her father had called grazing pasture was mostly dead grass and exposed hardpan, broken up by clusters of mesquite and the occasional half-dead oak. The fence line was a joke, more gaps than wire. Posts rotted through or missing entirely. In the distance she could see the small herd of cattle, 6 skeletal animals that looked like they were held together by spite and bad luck. "Your father run this place alone?" Rowan asked. It was the first personal question he'd posed. "Mostly. I helped when I could, but he—" Clara paused, choosing her words. "He didn't like asking for help. Thought it made him weak." It did make him weak. Pride's expensive out here. The bluntness stung, but Clara couldn't argue with it. Her father's pride had killed him, worked himself into an early grave trying to prove he could manage alone. borrowing money he couldn't pay back, refusing to sell when he should have cut his losses. They reached a small grove of cedar trees growing in a dry wash. The trees were twisted and stunted, but the wood was still good, dense and weather-resistant. Rowan pulled an axe from his belt and handed it to her. "You know how to fell a tree?" Clara looked at the axe, then at the trees, then at her ruined hands. "Yes." "Show me." It wasn't a test, it was an order. Clara approached the nearest cedar, a bent thing maybe 15 feet tall, and studied it. Her father had taught her this when she was 12. How to read the lean, where to make the notch, how to control the fall. She picked her spot, set her stance, and swung. The impact jarred her whole body. Her hands erupted in fresh pain where the blisters had barely started to heal, but the axe bit deep, and that was something. She swung again, and again. Found a rhythm despite the pain, despite the way her shoulders burned and her breath came ragged. Rowan watched without comment, his face giving nothing away. When the tree started to crack, Clara stepped back and let gravity finish the job. The cedar fell exactly where she'd planned it, landing with a thud that sent up a small cloud of dust. "Good," Rowan said. It was the first compliment he'd given, if you could call it that. "Do 5 more. I'll trim them." He moved to the fallen tree and started stripping branches with practiced efficiency. Clara turned to the next cedar, reset her stance, and swung. By the time she'd felled the 5th tree, her hands weren't just bleeding, they were hamburger. The axe handle was slick with blood, and every swing sent bolts of white-hot pain shooting up her arms. But she didn't stop. Wouldn't let herself stop, because stopping meant weakness, and weakness out here was expensive. Rowan looked at her hands when she finished. "You should have said something," he muttered. "You said we needed posts. I also need a worker who can hold a hammer tomorrow." He pulled a cloth from his pocket, relatively clean, and wrapped it around the worst of the bleeding. His hands were surprisingly gentle for how large they were, his movements economical. "Can't fix everything in one day, Clara. Trying just breaks things worse." It was the first time he'd used her name. "I can work," she said. "I know you can." "That's not the question." He finished wrapping her left hand and started on the right. "Question is whether you know when to stop before you ruin yourself permanent." Clara didn't have an answer for that. Her father had never taught her when to stop, only how to keep going. They hauled the trimmed posts back to the ranch in multiple trips, Rowan carrying 3 at a time over his shoulder while Clara managed one. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and hot. By the time they got the last post back, Clara's vision was swimming and her mouth tasted like copper. Rowan set down his load and looked at her critically. "When'd you eat last?" "Before the jerky." Clara had to think about it. "Day before yesterday." "Breakfast." His jaw tightened. "You're telling me you did all that work yesterday on no food?" "Didn't have any. Sold everything I could before the auction to try and pay down the debt. Didn't matter anyway." "It matters if you pass out and crack your skull open." He pointed at the porch. "Sit down before you fall down." "I can..." "Sit. Down." The command in his voice left no room for argument. Clara's legs made the decision for her, folding beneath her as she sank onto the porch steps. The world tilted sideways for a moment, then righted itself. Rowan disappeared into the house. She heard him rummaging around, cursing under his breath. When he came back out, he was carrying a tin cup of water and what looked like half a loaf of bread. "Drink," he said, handing her the cup. "Slow. You chug it, you'll just throw up." The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly metallic, but Clara had never experienced anything better. She forced herself to sip it, though her body screamed to gulp it down. Rowan watched her with that same unreadable expression, then held out the bread. "Eat. That's your food. And I'm telling you to eat it. I can go hungry. You're already half-starved. Now eat before I make it in order." Clara took the bread. It was dry and hard, probably a few days old, but when she bit into it, her whole body came alive with need. She ate slowly, the way he'd told her to drink, because she could already feel her stomach cramping. Rowan sat down on the other end of the porch steps, leaving space between them. He pulled out his own water flask and drank, staring out at the property like he was calculating something only he could see. "This place is worse than I thought," he said finally. "Then why'd you buy it?" The question came out before Clara could stop it. She tensed, waiting for anger, but Rowan just shrugged. "Needed land. This was available." "There's better land available. Cheaper too, probably. Maybe, but better land comes with better neighbors, people who ask questions, people who remember things. He glanced at her. Out here, nobody cares who you are or where you came from. That's worth something. Clara studied his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the scar cutting through his cheek, the way his eyes never quite settled on anything. He looked like a man who'd seen things he was trying to forget. "What are you running from?" she asked quietly. "Same thing as everyone else. The past." He stood, groaning slightly as his bad leg took his weight. "Rest another 10 minutes, then we set posts." He walked toward the barn, his limp more pronounced than usual. Clara watched him go and wondered what kind of past left scars like that. External and internal, both. She finished the bread, drank the rest of the water, and tried to convince her body it had enough fuel to keep going. Her hands were still bleeding through the makeshift bandages, and her muscles felt like they'd been put through a grinder. But she'd survived worse. Actually, that was a lie. She'd never survived anything like this. But she would, because the alternative was unthinkable. 10 minutes later, she was back on her feet, helping Rowan dig post holes for the new corral. The work was brutal. The ground was hard as concrete, every shovel of dirt an individual battle. Rowan worked beside her, his strength making her efforts look pitiful by comparison, but he didn't comment on it. Just kept digging, kept moving, kept expecting her to keep up. They worked through the afternoon, set 6 posts, strung wire between them. Clara's hands stopped hurting around hour 2, not because they'd healed, but because her nervous system had apparently given up trying to warn her about damage that was already done. She moved in a haze of exhaustion and stubborn determination, following Rowan's terse instructions, holding wire while he stapled it, steadying posts while he tamped earth around them. The sun was setting when he finally stepped back and surveyed their work. "It'll do for now," he said. "Tomorrow, we finish the rest." Clara looked at what they'd accomplished, 6 posts, maybe 20 feet of functional fence, and tried to feel something like pride. Mostly, she just felt tired. "I'm going to check the cattle," Rowan continued. "You get cleaned up. There's stew on the stove. Made it while you were resting. Eat all of it. That's not a suggestion." He walked off toward where the cattle were grazing, moving with that deliberate ground-eating stride. Clara stood alone in the dusty yard as the sky turned purple and orange, and for the first time since the auction, she felt something other than despair. Not hope. She wasn't fool enough to call it that. But maybe possibility. She went inside and found the stew, a thin broth with chunks of potato and what might have been rabbit. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and there was enough to fill her stomach. She ate standing at the stove, too tired to sit, and tried to remember the last time someone had cooked for her. Never, she realized. Her father had expected her to cook. Everyone had expected her to cook. She was a woman. That's what women did. But Rowan had just done it, without comment, without expectation of thanks. She didn't know what to do with that. Clara washed the pot and her bowl in a bucket of creek water, her wrapped hands making the task clumsy and painful. Then she stumbled to the back room and collapsed on the floor again, too exhausted to even remove her boots. Sleep came fast, dragging her under like a stone tied to her ankle. She woke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of movement. For a groggy moment, she thought Rowan was up early again, then realized the sound was coming from outside. Clara sat up, her body protesting every movement, and crept to the window. In the moonlight, she could see Rowan out by the barn. He was working. She could see him moving, lifting something heavy, his silhouette outlined against the silver-washed landscape. The temperature had dropped, cold enough that she could see her breath, but he was out there in just his shirt, working like the darkness and cold meant nothing. She watched him for a long moment, trying to understand what would drive a man to work in the middle of the night when dawn would come soon enough. Then she saw him pause, one hand pressed to his lower back, his head bowed. The gesture was so brief she almost missed it, a moment of weakness quickly hidden. He was hurting too, just better at hiding it. Clara lay back down and stared at the ceiling until sleep claimed her again. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of work and pain and small, strange kindnesses. Rowan woke her before dawn each morning, fed her something, bread, jerky, once a handful of dried apples that tasted like leather but filled the hollowness in her stomach. Then they worked. They finished the corral, repaired the barn's worst damage, cleared brush from around the house, fixed the water pump that had been broken since before Clara's father died. Every task revealed 10 more, but Rowan moved through them with methodical determination, prioritizing based on some internal calculation Clara couldn't follow. He didn't talk much, gave orders in short, clipped sentences, but he also didn't mock her when she struggled, didn't complain when her pace slowed, didn't treat her like the burden the rest of Blackwater had decided she was. And he kept feeding her, not generously, food was clearly scarce and what he had needed to last, but consistently. A meal in the morning, something at midday, stew or beans in the evening, always with that same gruff command, eat, all of it. Clara's body started to remember what fuel felt like. The dizzy spells became less frequent. Her hands, though still damaged, began to toughen up beneath the bandages Rowan changed every evening without being asked. On the fourth morning, she woke to find him already gone. No instruction, no food laid out, just his bedroll neatly stored and the house silent. Panic flickered through her chest. Had he left? Decided the property wasn't worth it after all? Decided she wasn't worth the effort? Then she heard the sound, metal on metal, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from the barn. Clara pulled on her boots and walked out into the pre-dawn cold. The barn door was open, spilling weak lamplight into the darkness. Inside, Rowan was working at a makeshift forge he'd apparently set up overnight, heating an iron bar until it glowed orange, then hammering it against a scarred anvil. He glanced up when she appeared in the doorway. "There's coffee on the stove," he said, his voice rough. "And cornmeal. Make yourself something. I'll be in when this is done." Clara stared at him. "You want me to make breakfast?" "I want you to eat breakfast. Whether you make it or I do doesn't matter much." "But I thought—" "You thought what? That I bought you to cook and clean?" He turned back to the forge, heating the iron again. "I bought land. You came with it because the law's stupid. You work the land same as me. Everything else we figure out as we go." He brought the hammer down, the impact ringing through the barn. Clara stood there another moment, trying to process, then turned and went back to the house. The coffee was thick and bitter, but it was hot. She mixed cornmeal with water and fried it in a pan, creating something that was almost edible. When Rowan came in 20 minutes later, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold, she'd set out 2 plates. He looked at them, looked at her, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You didn't have to," he said. "You didn't have to feed me these last few days. Guess we're both doing things we don't have to." Rowan sat down and ate without comment. Clara sat across from him, watching the way he moved, efficient, economical, like every motion had been calculated to waste nothing. The scars on his hands were thick and old, the kind you got from years of hard work or hard fighting, probably both. "What were you making?" she asked. "Hinges for the barn door. Existing ones are rusted through." "You know blacksmithing?" "Know enough. Learned it in—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Learned it a while back." "Learned it where?" Clara wanted to ask. In what context did a man learn to forge iron, to work land, to move like a fighter and think like a survivor? But the way Rowan's eyes had shuddered told her the answer wasn't coming. They ate in silence. When they finished, Rowan stood and collected both plates. "I'll wash these," he said. "You go check the cattle. One of them's limping, southeast corner near the dead oak. See if you can figure out what's wrong." It was the first time he'd sent her to work alone. Clara tried not to read too much into it, tried not to feel like it meant something, but it felt like trust, and she hadn't realized how much she'd needed that until she had it. The limping cow was easy to find, a scraggly brown animal with ribs like barrel staves and a gash on her front left leg, probably from barbed wire. Clara approached slowly, speaking in the low, steady voice her father had taught her, and examined the wound. It was dirty but not deep, needed cleaning and maybe a poultice to prevent infection. She made her way back to the house, found clean cloth and the bottle of whiskey Rowan kept in his saddlebag, pausing only a moment before deciding he'd rather have a healthy cow than full whiskey, and returned to the injured animal. Cleaning the wound was harder than finding it. The cow didn't appreciate Clara's help and made her opinions known with strategic kicks and aggressive headbutting. By the time Clara got the wound cleaned and wrapped, she was covered in dirt and cow spit, and her already damaged hands were screaming again. But the job was done. She found Rowan back at the barn, fitting his new hinges to the door. He glanced at her disheveled state and raised an eyebrow. "The cow's fine," Clara said. Barbed wire cut, but I cleaned it and wrapped it. She'll heal. You use the whiskey? Yes. I'm sorry. I should have. That's what it's for. Infection kills cattle, same as people. He tested the hinge, apparently satisfied with its movement. Good work. Those 2 words settled into Clara's chest like a warm stone. That afternoon, they worked on the house itself, patching the worst holes in the roof, replacing broken window glass Rowan had apparently brought with him, clearing years of accumulated debris from the corners and crawl spaces. It was humiliating for Clara, watching a stranger fix the home she'd grown up in, seeing through his eyes just how badly she and her father had let everything fall apart. We tried, she said at one point, not sure why she was defending a dead man to someone who hadn't asked. We just never had enough. Never enough money. Never enough time. Never enough help. Rowan was on a ladder, sealing a gap in the roofline with tar. Having enough isn't the problem. It's using what you have smart. Your father, no disrespect to the dead. He threw good money after bad. Borrowed to buy cattle he couldn't feed. Built a barn he couldn't maintain. Tried to work land that needed 2 men minimum. Pride makes poor decisions. He was alone. What was he supposed to do? Ask for help. Hire hands. Sell half the property and work the other half right. Admit he was drowning before he drowned. Rowan climbed down the ladder and looked at her directly. You can't survive out here on stubbornness alone. Believe me, I've tried. The weight in his voice made it clear he was talking about more than land management. Clara wanted to ask, wanted to know what had brought him here, what he was running from, why a man with his skills was buying failing ranches in the middle of nowhere. But she'd learned over the past few days that Rowan guarded his past the way other men guarded gold, and pushing would just make him close up tighter. So instead she asked, what do we do tomorrow? Cattle. They need to be moved to the north pasture, what's left of it. Better grazing up there, and the fence is mostly intact. After that, we start planning for winter. Winter's 4 months away, which means we're already behind. That night, Clara lay on the floor of her room. Rowan had promised to build her a bed frame when there was time, which felt like a kindness she didn't know how to accept, and took stock of her body. Everything hurt, but it was a different hurt than it had been. Not the sharp pain of fresh injury, but the deep ache of muscles being rebuilt. Her hands were still a mess, but they'd stopped bleeding. Her back had stopped screaming and settled into a dull throb. Her feet had developed calluses that made walking easier. She was adapting, hardening, becoming something she hadn't been before. The next morning brought rain, a cold, steady drizzle that turned the dust to mud and made every task twice as hard. Clara expected Rowan to call off the work, but he just handed her an oilcloth poncho that smelled like horse and said, "Cattle don't care about weather. Neither do we." They spent the day moving the small herd north, fighting mud and stubborn animals and rain that seemed designed to make them miserable. One of the cows broke away and had to be chased down through mesquite that tore at Clara's already ruined dress. Another got stuck in a wash and took both of them 20 minutes to extract, Rowan up to his waist in mud, Clara pulling on a rope until her shoulders felt like they'd separate. By the time they got all 6 animals secured in the north pasture, both of them looked like they'd been dipped in brown paint. Rowan surveyed their work, rain dripping off his hat, and nodded once. "Not bad," he said. Coming from him, it was practically a speech. They trudged back to the house as the rain finally let up, leaving everything slick and cold. Clara's teeth were chattering, and her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves. Rowan's limp was worse than usual, the cold and wet clearly aggravating whatever old injury plagued him. At the house, he stopped on the porch. "Get inside, get dry. I'll handle the evening work." "I can help." "Clara," he said her name with a kind of tired patience. "You're shaking so hard I can hear your teeth. Get inside before you catch something that lays you out for a week. That's not help. That's just more work for me." She wanted to argue, wanted to prove she wasn't weak, wasn't a burden. But the truth was she could barely feel her feet, and the idea of dry clothes and maybe a fire sounded like paradise. "Okay," she said quietly. Rowan's expression softened fractionally. "You did good today, both with the cattle and knowing when to stop. That's progress." He left her standing there, processing what might have been the closest thing to praise she'd ever received, and went to handle whatever evening tasks remained. Clara went inside, peeled off her soaked clothes, and stood shivering in her undergarments, trying to figure out what to do next. All her other dresses were just as filthy, She had nothing clean, nothing dry. A knock on the door frame made her jump. "Don't come in," she called, grabbing a blanket to cover herself. "Wasn't planning on it," Rowan's voice came through the door. "I'm leaving dry clothes on the floor out here. They'll be too big, but they're clean. Yours need washing, and you need to not freeze to death." She heard him set something down, then his footsteps retreating. Clara waited until she was sure he was gone, then cracked the door open. On the floor lay one of his shirts and a pair of pants, both clearly far too large for her, but dry and relatively clean. She put them on, rolling up the sleeves and cuffs, cinching the pants with a piece of rope. In the cracked mirror, she looked ridiculous, like a child playing dress-up in her father's clothes. But she was dry and warm. And the gesture itself, the casual thoughtfulness of it, made her throat tight. When she emerged from the back room, Rowan was at the stove, heating something that smelled like onions and salt pork. He glanced at her, and for just a second, something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "They fit," he said, deadpan. "They absolutely do not." "Close enough." He ladled stew into 2 bowls. "Sit, eat. Tomorrow we rest." Clara sat, accepting the bowl with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "Rest? Even land needs a day to recover, so do we." He settled across from her with his own bowl. "Besides, those clothes need washing, and I need to repair some tools. Day off doesn't mean day of nothing, just means different work." They ate in comfortable silence, the rain starting up again outside, drumming on the roof they'd just repaired. The house felt warmer than it had in months, maybe years. Not just from the fire, but from occupation, from purpose. Clara looked at Rowan across the rough table, this scarred stranger who'd bought her like property, but treated her like something else entirely. She still didn't know what to call what they were doing. This wasn't kindness exactly, wasn't friendship, wasn't anything she had words for, but it was something, and for now, that was enough. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the clothes. For all of it." Rowan didn't look up from his bowl. "Don't thank me for basic decency. Bar's too low already. Still, nobody else matters. We're fixing this place. That requires 2 functional people. I'm just maintaining my workforce." But there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't quite believe his own pragmatism. Clara smiled despite herself. "Right. Workforce. Finish your stew, and tomorrow you're teaching me how to cook something besides beans and meat. I'm tired of my own food." "You want me to teach you to cook? You think I like eating this?" He gestured at his bowl. "It's survival food. I want actual food. You know how, so teach me. Trade's fair." It was such a normal thing to ask, such a mundane domestic request, and somehow that made it matter more than any grand gesture could have. "Deal," Clara said. Outside, the rain continued, but inside, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt something that might eventually grow into hope. If she was careful, if she didn't examine it too closely, if she just let it exist. She finished her stew, washed the bowls alongside Rowan in companionable silence, and went to bed with his 2 large clothes still on and the ghost of warmth settling into her bones. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new pain probably, but tonight she'd survived. They'd survived, and that was becoming something worth holding on to. The morning after the rain brought crystalline air and mud that sucked at Clara's boots with every step. She woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory-cut substitute they'd been drinking, and found Rowan already at the stove, frying eggs in a pan she didn't recognize. "Where did those come from?" she asked, staring at the eggs like they were gold. "Traded some work in town yesterday while you were moving cattle." He slid 2 eggs onto a plate and handed it to her. "Fix the blacksmith's wagon wheel. He paid in goods." Clara accepted the plate, her mouth already watering. "You went to town?" "Had to register the deed, make it official." He cracked 2 more eggs into the pan for himself. "Nobody much cared. Paid my fees, did the work, left." She heard what he wasn't saying, that he'd gone alone, that he hadn't made her go back to face the people who'd laughed at her. The consideration behind it made her chest tight. They ate quickly, then spent the morning doing exactly what Rowan had promised. Washing clothes in the creek, Clara showing him how to actually scrub fabric instead of just dunking it and hoping, both of them hanging the wet garments on a line Rowan strung between 2 posts. It was strangely domestic, almost peaceful, the kind of work that didn't break your back but still needed doing. "You said you'd teach me to cook," Rowan said as they walked back to the house, his arms full of wet laundry. So teach. Clara looked at their meager supplies: flour, lard, some wild onions she'd found growing near the creek, the eggs, a bit of bacon. Not much to work with, but more than she'd had in weeks. All right, but you have to actually listen. No deciding you know better halfway through. I'm not that stubborn. Clara raised an eyebrow. Rowan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Fine. I'm that stubborn. I'll try to control it. She taught him to make proper biscuits, showing him how to work the dough just enough but not too much, how to tell when the lard was properly cut in. He was surprisingly attentive, his scarred hands following her instructions with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and flaky and smelling like comfort itself, he stared at them like they'd performed a miracle. It's just biscuits, Clara said. It's food that doesn't taste like punishment. He broke one open, steam rising from the soft interior. That's not just anything. They ate the biscuits with butter Rowan had also gotten from the blacksmith, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Just sat there eating something that tasted like normal life, like the world wasn't hard and mean and determined to grind them down. My mother used to make these, Clara said quietly, before she died. I was 8. Don't remember much about her, but I remember her biscuits. Rowan nodded slowly. My mother couldn't cook worth a damn, burned everything. We ate a lot of charcoal growing up. He paused. She tried, though. That counted for something. It was the first time he'd mentioned his family. Clara wanted to ask more, wanted to know where he'd come from, what had happened to leave him so scarred and alone. But the shuttered look was already creeping back into his eyes. We should check the north fence line, he said, standing abruptly. Make sure the cattle didn't bust through anywhere. The moment was over. Clara nodded and followed him outside, back to the work that never ended. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, coffee and whatever food they had. Work until the sun was high, fixing fences, tending cattle, clearing land, repairing the endless list of things that were broken. Break for a meal at midday. More work until the light failed. Supper. Sleep. Repeat. It was brutal. Clara's body adapted in ways she'd never imagined. Her hands stopped bleeding and developed calluses thick as leather. Her arms built muscle she'd never had. Her back learned to take the strain without screaming. She stopped feeling like she was dying at the end of each day and started feeling just exhausted, which somehow felt like progress. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ranch started to look less like a graveyard and more like a place where things might actually grow. Rowan remained a mystery. He worked like a machine, never complaining, never explaining. But Clara was learning to read him in small ways. The way his jaw tightened when his leg was bothering him. The way his eyes went distant when something triggered a memory he didn't want. The way he always made sure she ate before he did, even when food was scarce. He was taking care of her, not in any way she'd expected, not with soft words or gentle handling, but in the way that actually mattered, making sure she survived, making sure she got stronger. 3 weeks after the auction, Clara was checking the water pump when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She straightened, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt her stomach drop. 5 riders. She recognized the lead horse, a big roan gelding that belonged to Sheriff Morrison. The man himself sat tall in the saddle, his badge catching the light, his expression already set in official disapproval. Rowan emerged from the barn, took one look at the approaching riders, and his whole body language changed. Not afraid. Clara realized she'd never seen him afraid. But ready, like a blade being drawn. Stay behind me, he said quietly, as the riders pulled up in the yard. Sheriff Morrison dismounted with the casual authority of a man used to being obeyed. He was in his 50s, thick around the middle, with a face that had probably been handsome before too much whiskey and self-importance had bloated it. Mr. Hale, he said, his tone just shy of cordial. Thought I'd ride out, see how you're settling in. Settling fine, Rowan replied. His voice was flat, giving nothing. Something you need, Sheriff? Morrison's eyes slid past Rowan to Clara. She felt his gaze crawl over her like insects, taking in her work-stained clothes, her rough hands, the way she stood just behind Rowan's shoulder. Actually, there is. Got some questions about your arrangement here. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is the contract for Miss Whitmore's indenture. 7 years of labor, Legally binding. I'm here to make sure everything's being conducted properly. It is, Rowan said. Well now, I'll be the judge of that. Part of my duty is ensuring indentured workers aren't being mistreated. Morrison looked at Clara again. You being mistreated, girl? The question was a trap. Clara could feel it. She glanced at Rowan, but his face was stone. No, sir, she said carefully. I'm being treated fine. That's so. You look half-starved, clothes all torn up. Working you pretty hard, is he? The work's fair. I'm fed regular. Nobody's hurting me. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You sure about that? Because if Mr. Hale here is taking liberties, you're within your rights to report it. Contract doesn't give him ownership of you in that way. Clara felt her face burn. She understood what he was implying, and the fact that he'd say it out loud in front of other men made her want to sink into the ground. Nothing like that's happening, she said firmly. Good. Good. Morrison didn't sound convinced. He turned back to Rowan. Thing is, we got some complaints. People in town saying it ain't proper. You keeping a young woman out here alone. No chaperone. No witnesses to what goes on. Looks bad, Hale. Looks real bad. I don't care how it looks, Rowan said. Contract's legal. We're working the land. That's all that's happening. Maybe so. But appearances matter. People talk. And when they talk enough, it becomes my problem. Morrison shifted his weight, hand resting casual on his gun belt. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me inspect the property. Make sure the living arrangements are appropriate. Make sure Miss Whitmore's being treated according to the law. You cooperate, and I write up a nice report saying everything's fine. You don't cooperate. He shrugged. Well, that suggests you got something to hide. Clara saw Rowan's hands flex at his sides. The air felt suddenly charged, dangerous. The other riders, deputies she assumed, had fanned out slightly, their hands also near their weapons. Fine, Rowan said after a long moment. Inspect whatever you want. Morrison smiled like he'd won something. Appreciate your cooperation. Boys, let's take a look around. The next hour was humiliating. Morrison and his men went through the house room by room, commenting on everything. The sparse furnishings, the separate sleeping areas, the meager food supplies. They pawed through Clara's few possessions like they had a right to, made jokes about the too large clothes she wore, asked questions designed to embarrass and provoke. Through it all, Rowan stood silent. His jaw clenched so tight, Clara could see the muscle jumping. She wanted to tell him it was fine, that she'd endured worse, but the words wouldn't come. When Morrison finished with the house, he moved to the barn, the yard, even checked the cattle like he was looking for evidence of some crime. He found nothing because there was nothing to find, but that didn't stop him from creating problems out of air. This work's too hard for a woman, he declared, standing in the middle of the half-repaired barn. Those fence posts? That's man's work. You're violating the spirit of the contract by working her like a field hand. The contract says 7 years of labor, Rowan replied, his voice tight. Doesn't specify what kind. And she's capable of the work. You let the law decide what she's capable of. Morrison turned to Clara. You want to file a complaint? Say the work's too hard? Clara looked at the barn they'd repaired together, at the corral they'd rebuilt, at the land that was slowly coming back to life because of their combined effort. Then she looked at Morrison's smug face and felt something harden in her chest. No, she said clearly. I don't want to file anything. The work's hard, but it's fair, and I'd rather be here doing it than back in town being stared at like a freak show. Morrison's expression soured. Watch your tone, girl. I'm trying to help you. I don't need that kind of help. Clara, Rowan said quietly. A warning. But Clara was done being careful, done being small. You didn't care about helping me when I was standing on that platform being laughed at. Nobody in town cared. But now that I'm out here actually working, actually building something, suddenly everyone's concerned about what's proper. That's not help, Sheriff. That's gossip dressed up as law. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Morrison's face went red, his hand dropping to his gun belt in a gesture that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't far off. You've got a mouth on you, he said softly. That's going to get you in trouble. Rowan moved then. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberately. He placed himself between Clara and Morrison, his scarred face expressionless. I think you've done your inspection, Sheriff. Time for you to leave." Morrison stared at him, clearly weighing his options. The deputies shifted nervously. For a long moment, Clara thought violence was going to erupt right there in the dusty yard. Then Morrison smiled, cold and thin. "Sure, we'll leave. But I'll be back, Hale. And next time I might bring the territorial magistrate. Let him decide if this arrangement is legal." He swung back into his saddle. "You keep that girl on a shorter leash. Her smart mouth's going to bring you nothing but trouble." He spurred his horse and rode off, his deputies following. Clara and Rowan stood in the yard watching them disappear, dust hanging in the air like suspended judgment. When they were finally gone, Rowan turned to her. "That was stupid," he said. "I know. You just made an enemy of the sheriff, in a town that already hates you." "I know. He's going to come back, going to make this harder." "I know," Clara snapped. "I know it was stupid. I know it's going to cause problems. I know I should have just kept my mouth shut and let him say whatever he wanted. But I didn't, because I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter." Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, his expression softened fractionally. "Good," he said. Clara blinked. "Good? You stood up for yourself, for this place. That takes guts." He started walking toward the house. "Still stupid, but gutsy stupid is better than nothing." Clara stood there processing that, then hurried after him. "So you're not angry?" "I'm furious, but not at you." He paused at the door. "Morrison came out here looking for an excuse to shut us down. Didn't find one, so now he's going to manufacture one. We need to be ready for that." "Ready how?" "By making sure everything's so legal and proper he can't touch us. Separate quarters. We already have that. Chaperone would help, but we can't afford one. So we make the work visible. When we go to town for supplies, we go together. When people ask questions, we answer straight. We give them nothing to twist." "That's not going to stop the gossip." "No, but it might stop the law from taking you away." He looked at her directly. "That's what Morrison was threatening. He can claim the arrangement's improper, haul you back to town, auction you off again to someone he approves of, someone who'll pay him a cut. We don't give him that opening." The reality of it settled over Clara like a cold blanket. She thought buying her was the end of it, that the contract made her safe, at least from being sold again. But the law had loopholes, and men like Morrison knew how to exploit them. "Why are you fighting for this?" she asked quietly. "You could just let him take me. Find someone else to work the land." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Because I know what it's like to be property, to have your life decided by people who don't give a damn about you." He met her eyes. "And because you're good at this. The work. You don't complain, you don't quit, and you're getting stronger every day. That's worth fighting for." It wasn't a declaration of friendship. Wasn't even particularly warm. But it was honest, and Clara had learned that Rowan's honesty was worth more than most people's kindness. "Okay," she said. "So what do? We keep working, keep building. And when Morrison comes back, and he will, we show him a ranch that's thriving and a partnership that's working. We take away his ammunition." Partnership. The word hung in the air between them, strange and new. "Together," Clara said, echoing the word he'd used weeks ago when they'd started rebuilding the barn. Rowan nodded. "Together." The days after Morrison's visit were tense. Every sound made Clara jump. Every dust cloud on the horizon made her heart race, convinced the sheriff was returning with reinforcements. But days passed, then a week, and nothing happened. The work continued. They finished repairing the main fence line, got the cattle looking healthier on better grazing, even managed to clear a small field for planting winter wheat. The ranch was starting to resemble something functional, and Clara was starting to feel like maybe she belonged to it, not as property, but as someone who'd earned her place through sweat and blood and stubborn refusal to quit. Rowan remained largely silent, but Clara noticed small changes. He asked her opinion more, about which fence to fix first, where to put the new chicken coop he was building, how to season the venison he'd hunted. He taught her things too, how to read the weather from cloud formations, how to tell good lumber from bad, how to set a snare for rabbits. They were becoming a team, rough and unpolished and held together mostly by necessity, but a team nonetheless. Then on a cold morning 2 weeks after Morrison's visit, Claire went to check on the cattle and found the north fence cut. Not broken, cut. Clean slices through the wire in 3 places, the posts intact, the damage clearly deliberate. Her blood went cold. She ran back to the house and found Rowan already saddling his horse, his face dark with anger. "You saw it too?" she asked. "Saw it and tracked the bastards who did it. 2 horses came in from the east sometime after midnight, cut the fence, rode off. Professional job. Meant to look like the fence failed, but the cuts are too clean." Morrison? His men, probably. He wouldn't risk doing it himself. Rowan cinched the saddle tight. "They're trying to build a case that we can't maintain the property, that the contract should be voided. What do we do? We fix the fence, again, and we document everything." He pulled a small notebook from his saddlebag. "I'm writing down every incident, date, time, what was damaged. When this goes to court, and it will, we'll have evidence." "You think it'll actually go to court?" "I think Morrison's going to push until we push back or break. Neither of those is happening." He mounted the horse. "I'm riding into town. Going to file a report about the vandalism. Put it on record. You stay here, fix what you can of the fence, and don't let anyone on the property without me present." "Rowan, I'll be fine. It's you I'm worried about. Keep your rifle close. If anyone shows up who isn't me, you point it at them and tell them to leave. Don't fire unless you have to, but don't let them think you won't." He rode off before she could argue, leaving Clara alone with a damaged fence and a growing sense that everything they'd built was balanced on a knife's edge. She spent the morning repairing the fence, her hands working automatically while her mind raced. Someone had come onto their property in the dark and destroyed their work. Someone wanted them to fail badly enough to commit a crime, and the most likely candidate wore a badge and had the backing of the law. Clara was tightening the last wire when she heard a wagon approaching. She grabbed the rifle Rowan had left propped against a fence post and turned to face whoever was coming. It wasn't Morrison. It was a woman, middle-aged, weathered, driving a small cart pulled by a single mule. She pulled to a stop a respectful distance away and raised her hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy there," the woman called. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Clara kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but ready. "Who are you?" "Name's Sarah Chen. I run the general store on the east side of town." She climbed down from the cart, moving slowly. "I heard what Morrison did. Came to offer some help if you'll take it." "Why would you help us?" "Because Morrison's a bully and a crook, and I'm tired of watching him run roughshod over decent people." Sarah pulled a burlap sack from her cart. "Brought you some supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, things I heard you might be running low on." Clara stared at her, suspicion and desperate hope warring in her chest. "What's it going to cost me?" "Your trust, I suppose. And maybe a chance to prove not everyone in Blackwater is garbage." Sarah set the sack on the ground. "Look, I know what they did to you at that auction. I was there. I didn't bid because I couldn't afford to, not because I thought you deserved what happened. That was cruel, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up." The honesty in her voice made Clara lower the rifle slightly. "Morrison's planning something," Sarah continued. "I don't know what exactly, but he's been asking questions around town. About you, about Hale, about the legality of the contract. He's building a case to take you back. I thought you should know." "We already figured that much." "Then you should also know he's got the magistrate in his pocket. If this goes to court, the deck's stacked against you." Sarah hesitated. "But there might be a way around it." "What way?" "Marriage. If Hale married you, the indenture contract would be voided. You'd be his wife, not his property. Morrison couldn't touch you." The word marriage hit Clara like a physical blow. We're not." "I know. I'm just telling you it's an option, a legal one." Sarah picked up her empty sack. "I should go before someone sees me out here, but if you need anything, supplies, information, a witness to what's really happening, you send word to my store. I'll help however I can." "Why?" Clara asked again. "Why risk Morrison coming after you?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Because 10 years ago my daughter was in a similar contract. Different circumstances, but same power dynamic. The man who owned her contract worked her to death, literally. She collapsed in his field and never woke up. Morrison ruled it an accident, and the man walked away free." She met Clara's eyes. "I won't stand by and watch it happen again, not if I can help." She climbed back into her cart and drove away, leaving Clara standing in the dust with a bag of supplies and a head full of impossible thoughts. Marriage. To Rowan. The idea was absurd. They barely knew each other. He was a stranger with a violent past and scars he wouldn't explain. She was damaged goods, a woman the whole town had rejected. But Sarah was right about one thing. It would solve the legal problem. Morrison couldn't claim impropriety if they were married, couldn't auction her off to someone else, couldn't touch her at all. Clara was still standing there, lost in thought, when Rowan returned. He took one look at her face and dismounted quickly. What happened? Someone came. Clara gestured to the sack. Woman from town, Sarah Chen. She brought supplies and a warning. Morrison's building a case to void the contract. I know. I filed the vandalism report, and the deputy basically laughed at me. Said fences break all the time, couldn't possibly prove it was deliberate. Rowan's jaw was tight with fury. The whole system's rigged. She suggested something else, a solution. Clara took a breath. Marriage. If we married, the contract would be void. I'd be your wife instead of your indentured worker. Morrison couldn't claim impropriety. Rowan went very still. That's true legally, but it's also insane. I know. We barely know each other. I know that too. And I'm not... He stopped, seemed to struggle with words. I'm not husband material, Clara. I've got a past that would make your hair stand on end. Reasons I'm out here in the middle of nowhere. I can't offer you a normal life. I don't want a normal life. Normal life auctioned me off like livestock. Clara met his eyes. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to like me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to sign a paper that keeps Morrison from taking everything we've built. That's all it would be? A paper? That's all it needs to be. We keep working the ranch, keep the arrangement we have, just with different legal standing. Rowan stared at her for a long moment. Clara could see him calculating, weighing options, looking for alternatives that didn't exist. I need to think about it, he said finally. Okay. And if we do this, if you need to understand what you'd be tying yourself to. I'm not a good man, Clara. I've done things I'm not proud of. Things that would make you run if you knew. Then tell me. No. The word was final. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you deserve to know you'd be marrying a man with blood on his hands and ghosts in his head. Clara should have been afraid. Any sane woman would have been. But she looked at Rowan, at his scarred face and careful hands, and the way he'd treated her with more respect than anyone in her entire life, and couldn't make herself feel anything but certainty. I've got my own ghosts, she said quietly. Maybe that makes us even. Rowan's expression softened fractionally. Maybe. Let me think on it. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. He walked toward the barn, his limp more pronounced than usual, and Clara was left alone with the weight of what she'd just proposed. Marriage to a stranger, a future bound to a man she barely understood, a solution that solved one problem but created a dozen others. But it would be her choice, not the town's, not the sheriff's, not the law's. Hers. And somehow, that made all the difference. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the floor of her room listening to Rowan move around the house, his footsteps heavy and irregular, pacing like a caged animal. Once, she heard him go outside, heard the creak of the porch boards as he sat down. She almost went to him, almost said something, but the weight of what hung between them kept her frozen. Morning came gray and cold. Clara dragged herself up, splashed water on her face, and walked into the kitchen expecting to find Rowan already gone. Instead, he was sitting at the table, 2 cups of coffee already poured, his hands wrapped around one like he was trying to draw warmth from it. Sit, he said without looking up. Clara sat, accepted the coffee, waited. Rowan stared into his cup for a long moment before speaking. I was a soldier. Long time ago, different territory. We did things... He stopped, his jaw working. We did what we were told, what we thought was right. Turns out we were wrong about a lot of it. Clara said nothing. Let him find his words. After it ended, I tried settling down. Bought land, built a house, even had a woman who said she'd marry me. Then my past caught up. Men I'd fought with, men I'd fought against, didn't matter which. They came looking for revenge, for justice, for whatever they thought I owed them. His scarred hands tightened around the cup. They burned my house, killed my horses, beat me so bad I woke up 3 days later barely able to move. The woman left before I even healed, Can't blame her for that. Rowan, I'm telling you this so you understand what you'd be getting into. I'm not hiding out here because I like the scenery. I'm here because if I stay in one place too long, eventually someone recognizes me, someone remembers, and it all goes to hell again. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and tired. You marry me, you inherit that target. You become part of whatever mess follows me around. Clara took a sip of her coffee, buying time to think. You planning to bring that mess here? I'm planning to avoid it. But plans don't always work out. Nothing about my life has worked out the way it was supposed to, Clara said. My mother died when I was 8. My father worked himself to death trying to prove something to people who didn't care. I got sold at auction like a broken plow. The way I see it, at least with you, I know what I'm getting. A hard worker who treats me fair and doesn't pretend the world is anything other than what it is. That's a low bar. It's the only bar that matters out here. She set down her cup. So here's my answer, since you're taking your time giving me yours. If you'll have me, I'll marry you. Not because I love you, I barely know you. Not because I think it'll be easy. Nothing about this is easy. But because I'd rather face whatever comes next standing beside someone I trust than standing alone while Morrison and his friends tear apart everything we've built. Rowan studied her face like he was searching for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign she didn't mean it. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him. All right, he said quietly. We'll do it, but we do it right. Legal, witnessed, documented so tight Morrison can't find a single hole to crawl through. When? Soon as possible. Today, if we can manage it. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Get dressed in whatever you've got that's cleanest. We're riding into town. Clara's stomach lurched. Town? Need a preacher to make it legal, and witnesses who'll testify it was voluntary if it comes to that. He grabbed his coat. I know you don't want to face those people again, but we have to do this where it counts. He was right, and Clara hated it. But she went to her room, put on the blue dress she'd been auctioned in, now clean but still too tight, and tried to pretend her hands weren't shaking. The ride into Blackwater took an hour. Rowan drove the wagon in tense silence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon like he expected trouble. Clara sat rigid beside him, her mind racing through 100 scenarios, none of them good. When the town came into view, her throat went tight. The last time she'd been here, she'd stood on a platform being mocked and rejected. Now she was coming back to marry the man who'd bought her. The irony was so bitter she could taste it. Rowan pulled the wagon up in front of a small church on the edge of town. Not the main one, Clara noticed. A smaller building, older, with peeling paint and a modest cross above the door. Why here? She asked. Preacher's name is Davies. He doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't report to Morrison. Rowan climbed down, then offered her his hand. The gesture was so unexpected Clara almost didn't take it. You sure about this? Are you? Asked you first. Clara looked at his scarred face, his hard eyes, the hand extended toward her. A hand that had never struck her, never grabbed her, never demanded anything except honest work. I'm sure, she said, and took his hand. The church interior was dim and smelled like old wood and candle wax. A man in his 60s looked up from where he was arranging hymnals, thin, with kind eyes, and calloused hands that suggested he did more than just preach. Can I help you folks? We need to get married, Rowan said bluntly. Today. Now, if possible. And we need it documented proper, legal certificate, witness signatures, everything official. Preacher Davies set down the hymnals slowly, his eyes moving between them. That's quite urgent. May I ask why the rush? Because Sheriff Morrison's trying to void her indenture contract on grounds of impropriety. Marriage solves that problem. The preacher's expression shifted, not judgmental, but understanding. I see. And this is what you both want? Not coerced? It's what we want, Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. Davies studied them another moment, then nodded. All right, but I'll need witnesses. 2 at minimum. And I need to hear from both of you that this is voluntary. The law's going to ask questions, and I need to answer them honestly. Where do we find witnesses? Rowan asked. I can round up a couple of parishioners. Give me 10 minutes. Davies headed for the door, then paused. This is a binding commitment you're making. I know it's for legal reasons, but in the eyes of the law and the community, you'll be husband and wife. You understand that?" "We understand," Clara said. The preacher left. Rowan and Clara stood in the empty church, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. "You can still back out," Rowan said quietly. "So can you." "I asked first." "Stop asking. I already answered." Clara turned to face him. "Are you having second thoughts?" "I'm having about 1,000 thoughts, but second isn't one of them." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Just want to make sure you know what this means. After today, you're tied to me. My name, my reputation, my past. Can't undo that easy. After the auction, I was tied to you anyway. This just makes it official on different terms." Clara took a breath. "Besides, you're tied to me too. My reputation as the fat girl nobody wanted. My past as the daughter of a failure. My present as Morrison's target. That goes both ways." Something that might have been respect crossed Rowan's face. "Fair point." The door opened and Davies returned with two people, an older woman with gray hair and a kind face, and a younger man who looked nervous but determined. "This is Mrs. Fletcher and her son James," Davies said. "They've agreed to witness. I've explained the situation, and they're willing to testify if needed that this was done proper." Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, her eyes on Clara. "I remember you, dear, from the auction. What they did to you that day was shameful. If marrying this man keeps Morrison from causing you more grief, then I'm happy to help." The kindness in her voice made Clara's eyes burn. "Thank you." "Let's get started then," Davies said, moving to the front of the church. "Please stand here facing each other." Clara and Rowan took their positions. The preacher opened a worn Bible, found his page, and began to speak. The ceremony was brief and practical. No flowery language, no talk of love or devotion. Just the legal requirements, the binding words that would change everything. When Davies asked if Rowan would take Clara as his wife, he answered, "I will," in a voice that carried no hesitation. When he asked Clara the same, she looked at Rowan, at this scarred stranger who'd fed her when she was starving, worked beside her without complaint, and was now putting his own freedom on the line to protect hers, and said clearly, "I will." "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Davies closed the Bible. "You may seal the union with a kiss, if you wish." Rowan and Clara looked at each other. Neither moved. "Or not," Davies added diplomatically. "Let's get the certificate signed." The paperwork took longer than the ceremony. Davies filled out the marriage certificate in careful script, had both Rowan and Clara sign, then had Mrs. Fletcher and James witness and date it. He made 2 copies, one for the church records, one for Rowan to keep. "This is legal and binding," Davies said, handing Rowan the certificate. "If Morrison questions it, you send him to me. I'll testify it was done proper, voluntary, and witnessed. He won't have grounds to challenge it." "Thank you," Rowan said. He pulled out money, more than was probably necessary, and pressed it into the preacher's hand. "For your trouble. No trouble at all, just doing what's right." Davies turned to Clara. "I hope this brings you some peace, child. You deserve better than what this town's given you." They were almost out the door when Mrs. Fletcher caught Clara's arm. "Dear, one more thing. Morrison's going to be furious when he finds out. He doesn't like being outmaneuvered. You two watch yourselves, you hear? And if you need anything at all, you send word. There's more folks in this town than you think who are tired of his bullying." Clara nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Then she and Rowan were outside, climbing back into the wagon, the marriage certificate folded carefully in Rowan's coat pocket. They were halfway home when Rowan finally spoke. "We should stop by the land office, register the marriage, make sure it's in the official records before Morrison hears about it. He's going to hear about it soon. Mrs. Fletcher and her son will talk." "Good. Let him hear it from someone else. By the time he comes out to the ranch, it'll be too late to do anything about it." The land office was a small building near the center of town. The clerk, a bored-looking man in his 30s, barely glanced up when they entered. "Help you?" "Need to register a marriage," Rowan said, sliding the certificate across the counter. The clerk picked it up, scanned it, and his eyebrows shot up. "This is dated today. You just got married? That a problem?" "No, just unusual." He pulled out a ledger and began copying information. "This'll be part of the public record. Anyone can access it." "That's the point," Rowan said. The clerk finished writing, stamped the certificate with an official seal, and handed it back. Congratulations, I suppose. That'll be $2 for the filing fee. Rowan paid. They left. And just like that, Clara Whitmore ceased to exist. In her place stood Clara Hale, a name that felt foreign in her mouth, but solid in a way her old name never had. They were climbing back into the wagon when Clara saw him. Sheriff Morrison, standing outside the saloon across the street, watching them with an expression that could have curdled milk. He'd seen them at the land office, knew what they'd done. "Don't look at him," Rowan muttered, taking the reins. "Just get in." But Clara couldn't help it. She met Morrison's eyes across the dusty street and saw pure fury there. Saw the moment he realized he'd lost, that his carefully constructed plan had been dismantled before he could execute it. Morrison's hand dropped to his gun. Clara's breath caught. Rowan saw it too and went very still, his body coiled like a spring. For a long, terrible moment, Clara thought Morrison was actually going to draw. Thought this was going to end with blood in the street and everything they'd just done rendered meaningless. Then one of Morrison's deputies stepped out of the saloon, saw what was happening, and put a hand on the sheriff's arm. Said something low that Clara couldn't hear. Morrison's jaw clenched so tight she could see it from across the street, but he took his hand off his gun. "Let's go," Rowan said quietly. "Now." He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Clara kept her eyes on Morrison as they pulled away, watching him watch them, until the buildings blocked her view. Neither of them spoke until they were well outside town, the empty land stretching around them like a promise of safety. "That was close," Clara said finally. "That was him showing restraint. Won't last." Rowan's hands were tight on the reins. "We just humiliated him in front of his own town, made him look like a fool. He's not going to forget that." "What do you think he'll do?" "Something stupid and violent. Question is when and how." He glanced at her. "You need to learn to shoot proper. Not just point a rifle, but actually hit what you're aiming at. I know how to shoot. Knowing and doing under pressure are different things. I'll teach you." He turned his attention back to the road. "And we're going to fortify the ranch. Better locks, sight lines, maybe some early warning systems. Make it harder for anyone to come at us unexpected." Clara listened to him planning, his mind already working through scenarios and solutions, and felt something shift in her chest. They were in this together now, actually legally, bindingly together. For better or worse, though given their circumstances, worse seemed more likely. "Rowan?" "Yeah?" "Thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't what you wanted." He was quiet for a moment. "Wasn't what I planned, that's true, but wanting's complicated. This needed doing, so we did it. Sometimes that's enough." It was the most philosophical thing she'd heard him say. Clara wanted to push, to ask what he actually wanted, if he regretted it, if he saw her as anything more than a legal inconvenience he was stuck with. But the set of his jaw suggested he'd said all he was going to say on the subject. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the rough land in shades of gold and amber. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there for a moment, staring at the property like he was seeing it for the first time. "This is home now," he said quietly, "for both of us. Whatever comes, we face it here." Clara looked at the half-repaired barn, the new corral, the house that still needed work but was slowly becoming something solid. They'd built this together. Maybe that was as good a foundation as any. "Home," she agreed. They climbed down from the wagon, and Clara started toward the house, then stopped. Rowan was still standing by the wagon, his hand pressed to his lower back, his face tight with pain he usually hid. "You all right?" she asked. "Fine, just stiff from the ride." "That's not true." Clara walked back to him. "Your leg's bothering you, and your back's worse. I've seen you favoring it for weeks. It's old damage, nothing to do about it. Maybe, but you don't have to pretend it's not there. Not with me." She met his eyes. "We're married now, partners. That means when you're hurting, you can say so." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then slowly, he nodded. "All right, it hurts. Old wounds acting up. They do that when the weather changes or I push too hard." He paused. "Feel better?" "Actually, yes. Because now I know when to push you to stop and when to pick up the slack. You're already carrying more than your share." "Then we're even." Clara started toward the house again. Come on, I'll heat water for washing and we'll have a proper meal. It's not every day a person gets married. Clara, she turned back. Rowan was still standing by the wagon, his scarred face uncertain in the fading light. This thing we did today, this marriage, I know it's just paper, just strategy, but I want you to know I'm going to honor it. You're under my protection now, and I don't take that lightly. Anyone comes for you, they go through me first. The fierceness in his voice made Clara's throat tight. Same goes. Anyone comes for you, they'll have to deal with both of us. Something that might have been a smile crossed Rowan's face. Deal. They went inside together, and for the first time since her father died, Clara felt like she had something worth protecting. Not just land or property or legal standing, but partnership. The kind built on sweat and honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't love. Wasn't even close. But it was real. And out here, real was worth more than any pretty illusion. That night, they sat on the porch after supper, watching stars emerge in the vast sky. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The cattle lowed softly from the north pasture. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, indifferent to human drama. You think Morrison will actually let this go? Clara asked. No, but he'll have to be careful now. Can't claim impropriety when we're legally married. Can't auction you off when you're not property anymore. He'll need a different angle. Like what? Like proving I'm unfit. Digging into my past, finding crimes he can charge me with, getting me arrested or run out of town. Then you'd be left alone, vulnerable, and he could swoop in as the protective lawman. Rowan's voice was flat, factual. It's what I'd do if I were him. Clara absorbed that. So what do? We make sure there's nothing to find. We stay clean, stay legal, stay visible, and we build up enough goodwill with people like Sarah Chen and Mrs. Fletcher that if Morrison does make a move, we've got folks who'll speak for us. Building goodwill isn't exactly your strong suit. No, but it's yours. He glanced at her. You're better with people than you think. Honest, direct. People respond to that. People responded to me by laughing at an auction. Some people, the ones who matter, didn't. Rowan stood, groaning as his back protested. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start making this place bulletproof, literally and figuratively. Clara watched him go inside, his limp pronounced in the darkness. Then she sat alone on the porch a while longer, turning the strange reality of her new life over in her mind. Clara Hale, married woman, partner in a struggling ranch, target of a corrupt sheriff. It was terrifying and uncertain and probably doomed to end badly, but it was hers. The choice had been hers. The consequences would be hers too. And somehow, that made all the difference. She went inside to find Rowan had already disappeared into his room. Clara went to hers, lay down on the hard floor, and stared at the ceiling where moonlight painted silver patterns. Mrs. Hale, she thought. The name felt strange, foreign, but also like armor, something solid between her and the world that had tried to break her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards they hadn't fixed yet. Somewhere in town, Morrison was probably planning his next move, his fury at being outmaneuvered festering into something dangerous. But here, in this rough house on this difficult land, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not safety. Nothing was safe. Not happiness. Life was too hard for that. But purpose. Direction. The sense that she was building towards something instead of just surviving the collapse. She fell asleep with that thought, and for once, her dreams weren't nightmares. They were just dark and quiet and mercifully empty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new battles to fight. But tonight, she was Clara Hale, and that was enough. 3 days passed in tense quiet. Rowan taught Clara to shoot properly. Not just aim and hope, but breathe, squeeze, compensate for wind and distance. They set up targets behind the barn, tin cans on fence posts, and by the third afternoon, Clara could hit 5 out of 6 at 30 yards. Good enough to make someone think twice, Rowan said, watching her reload. That's all we need. They fortified the ranch, too. Rowan installed heavy bolts on the doors, cleared brush from around the house to eliminate hiding spots, even rigged a simple alarm system using tin cans and wire that would rattle if anyone approached after dark. It wasn't much, but it was something. And through it all, they worked the land. Fixed the irrigation ditch that fed the south pasture. Planted winter wheat in the cleared field. butchered one of the older cattle, and smoked the meat for winter stores. The ranch was taking shape, not beautiful, not prosperous, but functional, alive. Clara caught herself thinking of it as theirs more and more. Not Rowan's property that she worked, but something they were building together. The shift was subtle but real, and it changed how she moved through the days. On the fourth morning, Sarah Chen arrived in her cart, this time with her husband, a quiet man who nodded respectfully and stayed by the wagon while Sarah approached the house. "Brought you wedding gifts," she said, smiling. "Figured you didn't get any, given the circumstances." She handed Clara a basket containing flour, sugar, real coffee, and a small jar of honey. At the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a new dress. Simple blue cotton, but well made and in Clara's size. "Sarah, I can't." "You can and you will. Consider it an investment in your success. The more you two thrive out here, the more it proves Morrison doesn't run everything." Sarah glanced toward where Rowan was working on the barn. "How's he treating you? Really?" "Same as before. Works hard. Expects the same from me. Doesn't ask more than that." "And the marriage? That part working out?" Clara wasn't sure how to answer that. The marriage was mostly theoretical. They still slept in separate rooms, still maintained the same distance, still operated more like business partners than anything else. But there'd been small shifts. Rowan asking her opinion on things that mattered, her mending his shirts without being asked, the way they moved around each other in the small kitchen, no longer awkward, but familiar. "It's working," Clara said finally. "Different than I expected, but working." Sarah studied her face, then nodded. "Good. You need anything? You send word. And Clara?" "Morrison's been quiet. Too quiet. My husband hears things at the card games. Morrison's planning something, but nobody knows what yet. You two watch yourselves." After Sarah left, Clara showed Rowan the supplies. He examined each item carefully, then looked at her. "She's taking a risk, helping us. Morrison finds out, he could make trouble for her business." "I know. That's why we need to make sure this works. Not just for us." "No pressure then." But there was something that might have been approval in his voice. That afternoon, while Clara was hanging laundry, she heard riders approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Her stomach dropped, and she was reaching for the rifle they now kept by the door when Rowan appeared from the barn, his hand already on his pistol. But it wasn't Morrison. It was Mrs. Fletcher and her son James, along with 3 other people Clara didn't recognize. They pulled up in the yard, and Mrs. Fletcher dismounted with surprising agility for her age. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale," she said formally. "We need to talk." They gathered on the porch, all 7 of them crowded into the small space. Mrs. Fletcher did most of the talking. "Morrison's calling a town meeting tomorrow night. Says he's going to present evidence that your marriage is fraudulent, contracted under duress, and should be annulled. He's got the territorial magistrate coming in special to hear the case." Clara's blood ran cold. "What evidence? We did everything legal. He's claiming Rowan coerced you, that the marriage was his idea, forced on you to avoid consequences for improper conduct." Mrs. Fletcher's expression was grim. "He's got 2 men willing to testify they saw Rowan threatening you, heard him say he'd turn you out if you didn't agree to marry him." "That's a lie," Clara said flatly. "It was my idea. I suggested it. We know that. But Morrison's got the magistrate convinced, and he's going to push for annulment. Once that happens, he'll reinstate the indenture contract and auction you off again. This time to someone he controls, probably his cousin who runs the freight company." Rowan had gone very still, his face unreadable. "When's this meeting?" "Tomorrow at 7, Town Hall." Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. "There's more. He's also planning to bring charges against you, Rowan. Says he's been investigating your background and found evidence of crimes in other territories. Desertion, assault, maybe worse. He's going to have you arrested right there at the meeting." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara looked at Rowan, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, saw him calculating odds and options and finding nothing good. "So it's a trap," he said finally. "I show up, I get arrested. I don't show up, he annuls the marriage anyway and comes after Clara." "That's about the size of it," Mrs. Fletcher agreed. "But there's a third option. We've been talking, some of us who are tired of Morrison's bullying. There's maybe 20 families in town who want to see him brought down. If you two show up at that meeting with all of us behind you, if we testify about what we actually saw and heard, if we make enough noise that the magistrate has to listen to both sides." She shrugged. "It's not a guarantee. But it's a chance. Why would you do that? Clara asked. Risk Morrison's anger for us? One of the other men spoke up, a rancher named Patterson that Clara vaguely recognized. Because we're all one bad day away from being where you are. Morrison's been squeezing everybody, raising taxes, demanding bribes, running out anyone who questions him. He's turned Blackwater into his personal kingdom. Someone needs to stand up to him. Might as well be now. Plus, Mrs. Fletcher added quietly, what he did to you at that auction was cruel. Watching a whole town mock a grieving woman for entertainment. Some of us are ashamed we didn't stop it. This is our chance to do better. Clara felt her throat tighten. She'd spent so long thinking of Blackwater as monolithically hostile that she'd forgotten there might be decent people trapped in the same system she was. Rowan was still calculating. If I show up and he has evidence of actual crimes, testimony won't matter. I'll be arrested regardless. Does he have evidence? Mrs. Fletcher asked bluntly. Rowan's silence was answer enough. Then you need to decide what matters more, the old woman said. Running again or standing your ground? Because that's what this comes down to. Morrison's betting you'll run. He's counting on it. You stay and fight. Even if you lose, it changes the equation. After they left, Clara and Rowan stood in the yard watching the dust settle. The sun was lowering, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. You should go, Clara said quietly. Tonight, before the meeting. Get out of the territory, start over somewhere else. And leave you to face Morrison alone? I can handle... No. Rowan's voice was flat, final. That's not happening. But if he has evidence, if you actually did whatever he's claiming... I did. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Most of it, anyway. The war was ugly, and I was part of that ugliness. Afterward, I made choices I'm not proud of. Morrison digs deep enough. He'll find things that could put me in prison or worse. Clara absorbed that. Then you definitely need to leave. I'm not leaving you. He turned to face her, his scarred face fierce in the fading light. You hear me? I'm not running anymore. I've been running for 5 years, and all it's gotten me is more scars and more loneliness. This place, this partnership, this ridiculous marriage of convenience, it's the first thing I've had worth fighting for since everything went to hell. So I'm fighting. Even if you lose, especially if I lose, because at least then I'll lose standing my ground instead of running like I always do. He paused. But I won't ask you to go down with me. You can still back out. Tell the magistrate I coerced you, that everything Morrison said is true. You might be able to salvage something. Clara stared at him. You think I'd do that? Turn on you to save myself? I think you'd be smart too. Self-preservation isn't weakness. No, but betrayal is. Clara stepped closer, making sure he could see her face clearly. We made a deal, partners. That doesn't change just because the odds got worse. I'm going to that meeting, and I'm telling the truth about what happened, about what we built here. And if they don't believe me, if Morrison wins anyway, then at least I'll know I didn't cave. Something in Rowan's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or something too complicated to name. You're tougher than you look, he said quietly. I know. Took me a while to figure it out, too. That night, neither of them slept much. Clara lay in her room listening to Rowan pace, hearing him rummage through his belongings, preparing for whatever tomorrow would bring. Once, she almost went to him, almost knocked on his door and said something, though she wasn't sure what. But the moment passed, and she stayed where she was, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine how tomorrow would unfold. Morning came too fast. They did the necessary work, fed the cattle, checked the fences, maintained the routine because routine was all they had. Neither spoke much. The weight of what was coming pressed down on everything. At 5 o'clock, they cleaned up as best they could. Clara put on the dress Sarah had given her. It fit properly. Made her look almost respectable. Rowan wore his cleanest shirt and pants, though nothing could hide the scars or the hard-worn look of a man who'd lived rough. They hitched the wagon in silence and started toward town. The ride felt endless. Clara kept rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd explain, what details mattered. Rowan sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched, hands tight on the reins. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it locked behind his eyes. Blackwater came into view as the sun was setting. The town hall was lit up, people already gathering. Clara could see wagons and horses crowding the street, more people than she'd expected. Morrison had turned this into a spectacle, a public trial designed to humiliate and destroy. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop 2 blocks from the hall. "Last chance," he said. "You can still walk away. So can you." "Asked you first." Clara looked at him, this scarred, damaged man who'd somehow become the only person she trusted, and made her choice. "Let's go show them what we're made of." They walked toward the town hall together. People stared as they passed, whispering, pointing. Clara kept her chin up, her hand steady, even though her heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. The hall was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, more crowding the doorway. At the front, behind a makeshift judge's bench, sat the territorial magistrate, a severe-looking man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and cold eyes. Morrison stood beside him, looking smug and satisfied. The room quieted when Clara and Rowan entered. All eyes turned to them. Clara felt the weight of that attention, felt the judgment and curiosity and hostility radiating from the crowd. Then she saw Mrs. Fletcher, standing near the front with her son, saw Sarah Chen and her husband on the left side, saw Patterson and a dozen other faces she'd learned to recognize over the past weeks, the people who'd promised to stand with them. They weren't backing down. "Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale," the magistrate said formally, "please approach." They walked to the front of the hall. Morrison's smile widened as they got closer, like a cat watching trapped mice. The magistrate shuffled papers. "We're here to examine the legitimacy of a marriage contracted between Rowan Hale and Clara Whitmore, now Hale. Sheriff Morrison has brought evidence suggesting this marriage was coerced and should be annulled. Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale, how do you respond?" Rowan started to speak, but Clara cut him off. "It was my idea." Her voice rang clear through the hall. "I suggested we marry to solve a legal problem. Nobody forced me. Nobody threatened me. I made a choice." "Under duress," Morrison interjected. "Living alone with a dangerous man, dependent on him for food and shelter. That's coercion, Your Honor." "Is Mr. Hale dangerous?" the magistrate asked, looking at Rowan with interest. Morrison pulled out papers. "I have records from the territorial archives. Rowan Hale, formerly Sergeant Rowan Hale, dishonorably discharged from military service for insubordination and excessive violence. Wanted in connection with an assault in Silver Creek 2 years ago. Suspected of—" "I wasn't dishonorably discharged," Rowan said, his voice cutting through Morrison's recitation. "I was honorably discharged after my term ended. The insubordination charge was filed by a commanding officer I reported for war crimes. It was dismissed." "And the assault charge?" "I defended myself against 4 men who attacked me. The local sheriff ruled it self-defense. No charges filed." Rowan's jaw was tight. "You want to paint me as a monster, Sheriff, but you're working with half-truths and rumors." "I have sworn testimony that you threatened Mrs. Hale," Morrison shot back. 2 men who heard you tell her she'd be turned out if she didn't marry you." "Produce them," Rowan said flatly. Morrison gestured, and 2 men stood up from the crowd. Rough-looking characters Clara had never seen before. Hired testimony, obviously. They'd say whatever Morrison paid them to say. Before they could speak, Mrs. Fletcher stood up. "Your Honor, I witnessed the marriage, spoke to both parties before and after. There was no coercion. It was a legal union, properly conducted and voluntarily entered." "You're biased," Morrison snapped. "You testified for them before." "Then hear from me," Sarah Chen said, standing. "I've been out to their ranch, seen how they work together, how they treat each other. That's not a woman being abused. That's a partnership." More people stood. Patterson, the rancher. A woman who ran the bakery. A farmer named Hutchins. One by one, they testified. Not about the marriage itself, but about what they'd seen. About the ranch improving. About Clara looking healthier, stronger, less broken. About Rowan treating her with respect instead of cruelty. Morrison's face was turning red. "This is irrelevant. I have evidence of coercion." "You have paid liars," Mrs. Fletcher said sharply. "We all know those men. They'd testify their own mothers were witches for the right price." The magistrate held up his hand. "Enough. Mrs. Hale, I need to hear from you directly. Did Mr. Hale force you to marry him? Were you threatened or coerced in any way?" Clara looked at Morrison, saw his certainty that she'd crack under pressure, saw him already planning his victory. Then she looked at Rowan, standing beside her, ready to face whatever came. "No," she said clearly. "He didn't force me. I asked him to marry me because Sheriff Morrison was planning to void my indenture contract and auction me off again. Marriage was a legal solution to harassment. That's all it was. A solution we both agreed to. She's lying to protect him, Morrison insisted. She's been isolated, manipulated. I'm standing right here, Clara said, her voice rising. I can speak for myself. And I'm telling you the truth. Nobody forced me. Nobody manipulated me. I made a choice because I was tired of being treated like property by men who think they can control me. She turned to face the crowd, letting them see her fully. You all stood there and watched me be humiliated at that auction, laughed when I was mocked for my size, for my grief, for being unwanted. Then when someone actually treated me with decency, suddenly you all cared about my welfare? That's not concern. That's guilt. And you're trying to fix it by destroying the one thing that's worked out for me. The silence was absolute. Clara could feel the weight of it, could see people avoiding her eyes, shifting uncomfortably. This marriage is legal, she continued. It was witnessed, documented, and voluntary. If you annul it, you're not protecting me. You're punishing me for refusing to be a victim anymore. The magistrate was watching her closely. Strong words, Mrs. Hale. They're true words, and I'm done apologizing for them. Morrison stepped forward, desperate now. Your Honor, regardless of the marriage, there's still the matter of Mr. Hale's criminal history. He's a danger to this community. Based on what evidence? The magistrate asked. Dismissed charges, self-defense rulings, service in the military? He looked at Rowan. Do you have outstanding warrants, Mr. Hale? No, sir. Have you been convicted of any crimes? No, sir. Then I fail to see how past accusations, especially those that were dismissed or ruled justified, constitute grounds for arrest. The magistrate turned to Morrison. Sheriff, do you have actual evidence of criminal activity? Not speculation, not rumor. Evidence? Morrison's mouth opened and closed. He had nothing. The whole case was built on intimidation and assumption, and it was crumbling. I thought not. The magistrate gathered his papers. Based on the testimony I've heard, I find no grounds to annul this marriage. It appears to have been legally contracted, properly witnessed, and entered into voluntarily by both parties. The union stands. Morrison's face went purple. Your Honor, you can't. I can and I have. This hearing is concluded. The magistrate stood. Mr. and Mrs. Hale, you're free to go. Sheriff Morrison, I suggest you focus your energy on actual crimes rather than harassing citizens who've done nothing wrong. The hall erupted. Some people cheered, others grumbled. Morrison was shouting something Clara couldn't hear over the noise. She felt Rowan's hand on her elbow, gentle but firm, guiding her toward the door. They made it outside into the cool evening air. Clara's legs were shaking so badly she could barely walk. Rowan steered her to the wagon, helped her up, the first time he'd ever done that, and climbed up beside her. You all right? He asked. I don't know. Ask me tomorrow. Clara looked back at the town hall where people were still pouring out, still arguing. We won. We survived. There's a difference. Survival counts as winning out here. Rowan almost smiled. Fair point. They were about to leave when Morrison emerged from the hall, pushing through the crowd. His face was twisted with rage, and his hand was on his gun. This isn't over, Hale, he shouted. You hear me? This isn't over. Rowan met his eyes across the distance. When he spoke, his voice carried clear and cold. Yes, it is. You lost. Accept it. I'll have you run out of this territory. You'll do nothing because you've got nothing. Rowan gathered the reins. We're legal, we're married, and we're not going anywhere. You want to come after us again? You better bring more than lies and paid witnesses. He snapped the reins and the wagon rolled forward. Clara watched Morrison standing in the street, trembling with impotent fury, and felt something fierce and hot bloom in her chest. They'd won. Actually won. The ride home was quiet, both of them processing what had happened. The stars were coming out, endless and bright, and the land stretched dark and familiar around them. Thank you, Rowan said finally, for what you said in there. You didn't have to defend me that hard. Yes, I did. We're partners, that's what it means. Still, you put yourself on the line. So did you. Every time you fed me when you didn't have to. Every time you worked beside me instead of just ordering me around. Every time you treated me like I mattered. Clara paused. I know this marriage is just paper, just strategy. But the partnership, that's real. And I protect what's real. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. It's more than paper, he said finally. Maybe it started that way, but it's not anymore. You're my wife, Clara. Not in name only, in the ways that count. Clara's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying I choose you. Not because I have to, not because the law says so, but because you're the strongest, toughest, most honest person I've ever met. And if you'll have me, really have me, not just as a legal convenience, but as a partner in everything, then I'm yours, scars and ghosts and all. The wagon rolled to a stop in their yard. Home. The rough house, the half-repaired barn, the land they'd bled into. Clara turned to face him fully. I'm not easy to love, Rowan. I'm difficult and stubborn, and I've got my own ghosts. I know, I don't care. And I'm not beautiful. Not the kind of woman men write poetry about. I wouldn't know what to do with poetry anyway. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. But I know what to do with partnership, with loyalty, with someone who stands their ground when everything's falling apart. That's what I want. That's what I'm choosing, if you'll choose me back. Clara looked at their hands, his scarred and massive, hers work-roughened and capable, joined together in the starlight. She thought about the girl who'd stood on that auction platform, convinced she was worthless, thought about how far she'd come, how much she'd built, how strong she'd gotten. And she thought about this impossible man who'd bought her like property and somehow taught her she was worth more than she'd ever imagined. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady, certain. I choose you. I choose this. I choose us. Rowan pulled her close, not graceful, not romantic, just solid and real and right. Clara buried her face against his chest and felt his arms come around her, holding her like she mattered, like she was worth protecting, like she was home. They stood there in the darkness, two damaged people who'd somehow built something worth keeping, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future didn't look like survival. It looked like possibility. The weeks that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Morrison, humiliated and defeated, stopped harassing them directly. The vandalism ceased, the threats ended. He still glared when they came to town, still made snide comments, but he no longer had power over them. And Clara and Rowan settled into their marriage, the real version, not just the legal convenience. Rowan moved his things into her room, and they learned to share space, to navigate the intimacy of actually being married. It was awkward at first, both of them so used to solitude that togetherness felt foreign. But they adapted. They always adapted. The ranch thrived. The wheat came in better than expected. They sold 3 head of cattle for good money and bought 2 young heifers to build the herd. The barn got a new roof. The house got actual furniture beyond just the bare necessities. And people started visiting. Sarah Chen came by regularly with supplies and gossip. Mrs. Fletcher and her son helped with the harvest. Even Patterson and some of the other ranchers stopped by to share techniques and trade labor. Blackwater hadn't accepted them exactly, but they'd carved out a place that was theirs, earned respect through stubborn refusal to quit, and built something that couldn't be easily destroyed. 6 months after the town hall meeting, Clara stood in the yard watching Rowan work on a new chicken coop. Her hands rested on her stomach, feeling the small swell there. The baby they hadn't planned but were somehow ready for. She hadn't told him yet. Wasn't sure how. Wasn't sure if he'd be happy or terrified or some complicated mixture of both. As if sensing her gaze, Rowan looked up and smiled, a real smile, the kind that transformed his scarred face into something almost gentle. "What?" he called. "Nothing, just watching." "Come help instead of watching. These boards won't hold themselves." Clara walked over, moved into the easy partnership they'd developed, and decided to tell him later. After supper, maybe. Or tomorrow morning. The timing didn't matter. What mattered was that they were here, together, building something that would outlast them both. She'd been sold like property, had been mocked and rejected and told she was worthless. But she'd found her worth anyway. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she'd built it with her own hands, alongside someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. That was the lesson, Clara thought as she worked beside her husband in the afternoon sun. Worth wasn't something you were born with or that others bestowed. It was something you claimed, something you fought for, something you built from nothing when the world said you had nothing to build with. She'd been Clara Whitmore, unwanted daughter of a failed rancher. Now she was Clara Hale, partner in a thriving ranch, wife to a good man, soon to be mother. The change hadn't been smooth, hadn't been pretty, hadn't been anything like the stories promised, but it was real. And real, she'd learned, was better than any fairy tale. That night after supper, she told Rowan about the baby. He went very still, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled her close and whispered against her hair that he was terrified and thrilled and had no idea how to be a father, but would figure it out the same way they'd figured out everything else, together. And Clara, standing in the rough kitchen of the house they'd rebuilt, held by the man she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back, felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Real, solid, earned hope. The kind that survives storms because it's built on foundation stone instead of wishes. The kind that lasts. Outside, the land stretched endlessly under a sky full of stars. The cattle lowed softly from the pasture. The wind rattled through the wheat field, promising harvest. And in a small house on difficult land, two people who'd been broken built something whole. Not perfect. Never perfect. But theirs. And that was enough.